The moment you stop chasing, something subtle but profound begins to shift in human dynamics. Not externally at first, but internally, in the invisible architecture of the relationship. Because what most people don't realize is that emotional systems are built on response patterns. One person reaches, the other retreats. One pursues, the other regulates distance. And over time, that becomes the language of the connection itself. Now, when someone with avoidant tendencies is involved, this pattern becomes even more pronounced. They are not simply avoiding you, they are avoiding emotional intensity, perceived pressure, and vulnerability. But here's the deeper truth. They also become accustomed to a very specific role you play in that system. The role of pursuit, the role of emotional activation, the role of proving that the connection still matters. And so when you suddenly withdraw that role, not in anger, not in manipulation, but in quiet clarity, you interrupt the entire psychological equilibrium. At first, it doesn't look like much. There is no dramatic reaction, no immediate change in behavior. In fact, the silence may even feel like nothing is happening. But that is precisely where the transformation begins. Because the avoidance system is calibrated for response. It is built on expectation. And expectation is a form of control, not in a malicious sense, but in a predictable sense. They expect you to text again. They expect you to explain again. They expect you to soften the distance they create. When that expectation is not met, something unusual happens internally. The absence of your pursuit creates a gap, and that gap is not neutral, it is active. It forces a recalibration of emotional assumptions. Suddenly, the familiar rhythm is gone. The emotional environment they were unconsciously regulating through distance, and your pursuit is no longer stable. This is where the power shift begins, not as confrontation, but as withdrawal of reinforcement. From a psychological standpoint, human attachment systems are deeply sensitive to consistency. Even inconsistent attention can become a form of emotional structure. So when you were chasing, even if it created anxiety or frustration, it still created structure. It still told them, this connection is alive. This person is still engaged. The system is still functioning. But silence disrupts structure. And the mind does not easily tolerate unstructured emotional space. So now they are left with something unfamiliar, not your absence, but your non-reaction. And non-reaction is far more unsettling than rejection. Rejection still contains information. It is clear, it is defined, it is emotionally readable. But silence is ambiguous. Silence forces interpretation. Silence invites uncertainty. And uncertainty is where psychological reflection begins to emerge, even in people who typically avoid emotional depth, because the brain naturally tries to resolve ambiguity. It asks questions without permission. Why did they stop? Did they move on? Did I matter more than I thought or less? This is the first fracture in the avoidance internal narrative. Not because you said something new, but because you stopped saying anything at all. And in that absence, the role you once played becomes visible to them in a way it never was before. Not as something they controlled, but as something they depended on. Not as something guaranteed, but as something now missing. This is why silence is not emptiness in emotional dynamic set is information. It is a signal that the previous system no longer applies. And when a system collapses, even quietly, the mind is forced to reassess its assumptions about connection, attachment, and consequence. But perhaps the most important layer here is this. Your silence is no longer a reaction to them. It becomes a decision about you. It stops being about withholding communication and starts becoming about withholding emotional labor that was never being reciprocated at the level it deserved. And in that moment, something fundamental changes. You are no longer participating in the cycle that required you to overextend in order to maintain connection. You are no longer compensating for emotional distance with emotional intensity. You are no longer filling a gap that was never acknowledged. You are simply no longer available in the way you used to be. And that shift, quiet, stable, and grounded, creates the first real disruption in a dynamic. built on pursuit and retreat. Because when the pursuer stops pursuing, the entire architecture of the connection is forced to reveal what it truly was built on. And sometimes what it reveals is not love being lost, but imbalance being exposed. What begins to happen next is far more psychological than most people realize. Because when you've been in a dynamic where you are the one who consistently reaches out, explains, repairs, and re-engages, the other person begins to build an internal model of you, not consciously, but automatically. You become the one who comes back, the one who cares enough to fix it, the one who won't stay silent for long. That model becomes a form of emotional certainty for them. And certainty, even in unhealthy dynamics, feels like stability. So when an avoidant person pulls away, there is often an unspoken expectation running in the background of their behavior. You will eventually bridge the gap. You will eventually reinitiate contact. You will eventually re-enter the emotional field and restore the familiar rhythm. That expectation is not necessarily cruelty, it is conditioning. It is based on repetition. Every time distance appeared in the past, pursuit followed. Every time silence happened, response eventually came. So they begin to interpret that pattern as law. But the moment you change your behavior, you are no longer just changing communication. You are breaking a psychological contract they didn't even realize they were relying on. And here is where the shift becomes deeply uncomfortable for them. Your silence is no longer an echo of temporary distance. It becomes a new data point. It does not confirm the old story. It contradicts it. At first, the mind resists that contradiction because the human brain is not built to accept instability in relational expectations easily. It tries to normalize it. It says, maybe they're busy. Maybe they're upset. Maybe they just need time. That is the first layer. Interpretation, an attempt to preserve the old model of you. But as time passes and nothing changes, those explanations begin to lose strength. And that is where the real disruption begins, not in emotion, but in prediction error. In psychology, prediction error is what happens when reality no longer matches expectation. And the greater the gap between the two, the more the mind is forced to update its understanding. The avoidant, who once assumed your return, now encounters something they are not prepared for. Consistency in your absence. You are no longer reacting to their withdrawal. You are no longer filling the silence they created. You are no longer reestablishing contact to stabilize emotional discomfort. And because of that, the system they were used to no longer completes itself. This creates a subtle but powerful internal experience. Unresolved expectation. And unresolved expectation is psychologically louder than rejection. Rejection is final. It closes a door, but unresolved. Expectation keeps the door half open in the mind, forcing ongoing cognitive processing. They may not express it outwardly. In fact, they might appear unaffected, but internally, something is now being tracked, measured, and recalculated. Why didn't they follow? Why didn't they reach out again? Did I misread their attachment? Did I assume something that wasn't stable? These questions don't always lead to immediate emotional insight. Often they lead to discomfort first. Because what is? Being challenged is not just your behavior, it is their assumption of your availability. And that assumption is deeply tied to control, even if it was never conscious control. Because when someone believes you will always return, they do not feel urgency to engage differently. They do not feel urgency to repair differently. The emotional risk is softened by your predictability. But when you become unpredictable in your absence, something shifts in the internal balance of power, not in a dramatic confrontation, but in perception. You are no longer the emotional constant in their system. And once that realization begins to take root, even subtly, it creates a reevaluation of the entire relational history. Not just what you did, but what they assumed about you. And that is where the deeper truth begins to surface. They were not just reacting to you leaving. They were reacting to the loss of the certainty that you would never stay gone. Because when someone realizes that your absence is not temporary, the entire emotional framework they built around your presence begins to collapse. And in that collapse, the mind is left with one undeniable realization it can no longer avoid. What they thought they could rely on was never guaranteed. And that changes everything. Because once certainty is broken, it cannot be assumed again, it has to be rebuilt, if it can be rebuilt at all. What happens next is where most people misunderstand the real transformation. They think silence is about punishment or strategy or trying to get a reaction. But in its highest form, silence is none of those things. It is a state of emotional detachment that changes how you are perceived in the other person's mind, not because you are doing something to them, but because you are no longer over inserting yourself into a space that was never emotionally balanced to begin with. When you stop reacting, something unusual begins to form. Emotional ambiguity. And ambiguity is powerful because it forces interpretation. In the past, your presence was emotionally readable. If they withdrew, you reached. If they distanced, you clarified. If they went quiet, you filled the space. That created a very clear emotional script. They may not have consciously recognized it, but it made you predictable. And predictability, even in relationships that feel intense, creates a kind of emotional safety for the person who prefers distance. They know on some level that no matter how far they pull, the connection remains accessible. But when you remove that accessibility, not through anger, not through manipulation, but through calm non-response, you remove readability. And the human mind does not like what it cannot read. This is where curiosity replaces assumption. At first, they may not notice it consciously. There is often a delay between behavior change and psychological recognition. But over time, your absence of reaction becomes more noticeable than any reaction ever was. Not because you are louder in silence, but because you are no longer predictable in engagement. And unpredictability, when it comes from someone who was previously emotionally available, creates a kind of cognitive disruption. The mind starts filling in the blanks. It tries to reconstruct meaning where response used to exist. And because there is no new emotional data coming from you, it is forced to rely on memory, comparison, and self-questioning. This is where curiosity begins to emerge, not romantic. Curiosity, not longing in the traditional sense, but psychological curiosity. What changed? Why didn't they respond this time? Are they upset? Or have they moved on? Was I more significant to them than I realized? These are not surface level questions. They are signs that your emotional presence has shifted from something assumed to something now analyzed. An analysis only happens when something can no longer be taken for granted, but there is something deeper happening underneath. Curiosity, something quieter, more uncomfortable, and more revealing. The absence of emotional control. Because when you were responding, even in frustration or emotional intensity, you were still participating in the system. You were still part of the emotional feedback loop that allowed them to regulate distance without fully confronting its consequences. Your engagement, even when it came from pain or confusion, still anchored the connection. But silence removes that anchor. And without an anchor, the emotional environment becomes unmoored. This is where avoidance meets reflection in an unexpected way. Not because the avoidant suddenly becomes deeply introspective, but because the absence of your energy forces a confrontation with something they were not actively engaging with before. Their own role in the dynamic. When someone is used to emotional pursuit, they are not required to sit with the full weight of their own distancing behavior. There is always movement, always reconnection, always reactivation of the bond. But when that movement stops, there is a stillness that cannot be outsourced. And in that stillness, perception begins to shift. You are no longer defined by your reactions to them. You are now defined by your absence from the pattern itself. And that absence creates a kind of psychological elevation, not in the sense of superiority, but in the sense of distance from the emotional cycle. You are no longer inside the push-pull dynamic. You are observing it from outside. And that is what makes silence so misunderstood. People assume silence is empty, but in relational psychology, silence is often the most information-dense state. It does not say less, it removes distortion. It strips away noise, reaction, emotional overextension, and leaves only what cannot be ignored. The reality of non-engagement. And that reality forces a subtle but powerful recalibration. Because once someone experiences you as emotionally unavailable, not temporarily, but consistently, they can no longer relate to you through assumption. They have to relate to you through uncertainty. And uncertainty is where perception begins to deepen, shift, and reorganize itself around something new. Not around your reaction, but around your absence of one. And in that absence, a new question quietly forms in their mind, one they were never forced to ask before. Not will they come back, but something far more unsettling. What if they don't? Now here's where the process moves into a deeper psychological layer that most people never see because it doesn't happen in front of, it happens inside the other person. When your silence holds, when your emotional pursuit stops, when your reactions are no longer available to stabilize the dynamic, something begins to happen internally for the avoidant. Not necessarily immediate emotional awakening, but reflection through friction. And I want to be precise here, this isn't romanticized. They suddenly realize you're worth thinking. That's not how the mind works under emotional recalibration. What actually happens first is discomfort, a kind of internal tension that arises when a familiar relational structure stops functioning the way it used to. Because up until this point, the avoidant dynamic was balanced, internally balanced for them, not necessarily for you by distance on one side and pursuit on the other. That balance allowed them to engage without fully confronting emotional depth. It created space. It created breathing room. It created control over intensity. But when your pursuit disappears, the system doesn't feel peaceful. It feels incomplete. And incompleteness forces attention inward. This is where self-reflection begins, not as a deep philosophical awakening, but as a series of uncomfortable micro-realizations. At first, it shows up as confusion. Why isn't this resolving itself the way it usually does? Then it becomes irritation. Why am I still thinking about this? And then, more subtly, it becomes something harder to ignore. Self-inquiry. What role did I play in this dynamic? Did I push them further than I realized? Did I assume their availability was guaranteed? These questions are not always conscious. Sometimes they appear as emotional residue rather than clear thoughts, a sense of restlessness, a lingering unease, a memory that keeps resurfacing without resolution. And here's the key insight. Reflection doesn't require willingness. It only requires disruption of pattern. When a pattern is stable, the mind stays efficient. It doesn't overanalyze what it believes it already understands. But when a pattern breaks, especially one tied to emotional regulation, the mind is forced to reprocess meaning. That reprocessing is where reflection lives. Now, for someone with avoidant tendencies, this can be particularly complex because reflection is not just about you, it becomes a mirror. And avoidant strategies are often built around minimizing internal emotional pressure. So when silence removes external regulation, your responses, your reassurance, your pursuit, it leaves them alone with internal signals they didn't have to fully sit with before. Not necessarily emotional overwhelm, but emotional exposure. And exposure is different from intensity. Intensity can be avoided. Exposure cannot, because exposure is simply awareness without interruption. And in that awareness, they begin to notice something subtle. The connection is no longer automatically self-sustaining. It is no longer being carried by your effort. It is no longer being revived after distance by your initiation. And that realization creates a quiet but important shift in perception. This dynamic required my participation more than I acknowledged. That is a form of reflection, not necessarily remorse. Not necessarily regret, but awareness of contribution. And awareness of contribution is where accountability begins to form, not impose from the outside, emerging from the breakdown of assumption. At the same time, something else is happening alongside this. Memory reinterpretation. Past interactions begin to look slightly different, not because the events changed, but because the emotional context around them is no longer being stabilized by your presence. Moments where you reached out may now be seen differently. Moments where they withdrew may now carry more weight than they previously did. Not because reality changed, but because the emotional system that filtered those experiences has been disrupted. And when the filter changes, meaning changes, this is why silence is not passive. It is cognitively active. It forces reevaluation without direct confrontation. It creates space where the mind can no longer rely on immediate emotional resolution through you. And in that space, self-reflection becomes unavoidable. But perhaps the most important part of this entire process is not what they realize about you, it's what they begin to realize about the structure they were participating in. A structure where distance was manageable because pursuit always followed. A structure where emotional absence was tolerable because re-engagement was expected. A structure where control was never openly discussed, but quietly maintained through predictable cycles. And when that structure breaks, reflection is not optional anymore. It is the only way the mind can stabilize what no longer behaves predictably. And in that stabilization, something fundamental begins to form. Awareness that the dynamic they took for granted required more balance than they were consciously contributing. And once that awareness appears, even faintly, it cannot be fully unseen again. Because what the mind has once had to explain to itself, it will continue trying to understand until it finds closure. And that is where the real shift begins, not in what they feel about you, but in what they can no longer ignore about themselves. What most people don't realize is that relationships like this don't collapse in a single dramatic moment. They collapse in structure first and only later in emotion. And the structure we are talking about here is control, subtle, unspoken, often invisible control that exists in patterns of pursuit and withdrawal. In many avoidant dynamics, control is not about dominance in the traditional sense. It's about emotional spacing. One person creates distance, the other closes it. One person withdraws, other restores connection. Over time, this becomes a rhythm that feels natural, even if it's unhealthy. But what's important to understand is that this rhythm creates an illusion that the system is self-correcting. It is not. It is being continuously corrected by one person's effort. So when you stop correcting it, when you stop chasing, explaining, reaching, or restabilizing the emotional gap, you are not simply stepping back. You are removing the mechanism that kept the entire dynamic functioning. And that is where the control structure begins to collapse. At first, it doesn't feel like collapse. It feels like distance. It feels like space. It feels like nothing is happening. But underneath that surface, something fundamental is shifting. The predictable emotional feedback loop is gone. The avoidant no longer experiences the familiar sequence of withdrawal followed by pursuit. That sequence is what allowed emotional distancing to remain sustainable without full relational consequence. Because no matter how far they pulled back, the system always reactivated. Your response always reconnected it. But when that no longer happens, the cycle is interrupted mid-process. And an interrupted cycle does something psychologically powerful. It creates instability in expectation. Now they are no longer interacting with you in a system they understand. They are interacting with absence that does not resolve itself through familiar behavior. And here is where control begins to erode, because control and emotional dynamics is not about force, it is about predictability. It is the ability to anticipate outcomes based on prior patterns. When someone pulls away and knows you will return, there is a form of control in that predictability. Not necessarily conscious control, but structural control. The system behaves in a known way. But when you stop returning, predictability disappears. And when predictability disappears, control is no longer available in the same form. Replaces it is uncertainty. And uncertainty forces adaptation. At first, the avoidant mind will attempt to restore the old structure. It may do this quietly by waiting, by observing, by assuming the pattern will resume itself. This is the system trying to self-correct without changing its internal model. But as time passes and no correction comes from you, that assumption weakens. And when assumptions weaken, something else begins to form. Recalibration, not emotional expression, not immediate confrontation, but recalibration of expectations. This is where the dynamic truly shifts, because they are no longer operating from, if I withdraw, they will return. They are now confronted with, if I withdraw, nothing follows. And that second realization is structurally destabilizing, because it means their emotional distance no longer produces the same outcome. And once an outcome changes, behavior must either adapt or lose its meaning. So now the system faces a choice it was never previously forced to make: adjust engagement or sit in disconnection. And disconnection, when it is no longer temporary, begins to feel different. It is no longer part of a cycle. It becomes a state. This is where emotional control starts to dissolve, not because anyone is fighting for it, but because the mechanism that supported it is no longer active. And in that absence, something subtle happens internally for them. They begin to recognize, even if not consciously, that access to you is no longer automatic. That emotional reentry is no longer guaranteed. That the familiar rhythm they relied on is no longer reliable. And that realization has weight, because it shifts the perceived cost of distance. Before, distance was low risk. Now distance carries uncertainty. And when distance becomes uncertain, the entire strategy of withdrawal loses its stability. This is the moment where control dynamics quietly flip, not in dramatic confrontation, but in structural imbalance. You are longer compensating for their absence. And because of that, their absence no longer produces automatic resolution. What they once experienced as space with return becomes space without certainty. And psychologically, that is a completely different environment. Because now, every moment of distance contains an unanswered question, not about you returning, but about whether the system they were relying on will ever behave the same way again. And once that question is asked, even silently, the old structure cannot fully reassemble itself in the same way. Because control is not lost in a single moment. It is lost when predictability stops obeying expectation. And in that gap between expectation and reality, the entire emotional architecture begins to shift quietly, irreversibly, and without needing permission from either side. And what remains is not control, but awareness that the control was never balanced to begin with. What ultimately emerges at the end of this entire process, not just a change in how the other person perceives you, but a fundamental shift in how you exist inside the dynamic at all. Because when you stop reacting, stop chasing, stop over-explaining, and stop trying to restore emotional equilibrium that was never mutual, something very important happens. You are no longer defined by participation in instability. And that is where your silence stops being a tactic and becomes a standard. This distinction is critical. A tactic is reactive. It still lives. Inside the emotional system, it just tries to influence it differently. But a standard is different. A standard is self-definition. It is not about them anymore. It is about what you will and will not continue to engage with. So when your silence settles into consistency, it begins to communicate something far more powerful than words ever could. That access to you is no longer automatic, and emotional presence is no longer something you distribute at the cost of your own stability. And this is where the real philosophical shift occurs. Because at first, people often frame silence as a response to the other person. I'm not texting because they didn't text. I'm not reaching out because they withdrew. But at a deeper level, that is still emotional dependency disguised as restraint. True silence is different. It is not built on what they did. It is built on what you no longer accept. And once that internal shift happens, your emotional center of gravity moves. You are no longer orbiting their behavior. You are orbiting your own standard. Now, whether the avoidant returns or not becomes secondary, not irrelevant, but secondary, because the emotional equation has changed. You are no longer in a position of pursuit, waiting for resolution from outside. You are in a position of alignment where your behavior reflects your internal boundary, not their inconsistency. And this is where something paradoxical happens. The more grounded your silence becomes, the less it is about they at all. It becomes about coherence, about integrity between what you feel and what you allow, about refusing to continue cycles that require self-abandonment in order to maintain connection. And when a person reaches that state, something shifts in their energy that is perceptible even without words, not because they become colder, but because they become internally anchored. They are no longer emotionally negotiable in the same way. They are no longer accessible through the same pressure. Points that used to work. And this is often the point where the avoidant dynamic becomes confused because the old system stops producing results. The emotional buttons that once triggered engagement no longer activate the same response. Not because feelings necessarily disappeared, but because access has changed form. But again, the deeper transformation is not about how the other person responds. It is about what you stop requiring from them in order to remain stable within yourself. Because before this shift, your emotional stability may have been indirectly outsourced. You felt regulated when they responded. You felt unsettled when they withdrew. You felt urgency when they went silent. And that created a subtle dependence, not necessarily on the person, but on the pattern. Now that pattern is interrupted. And when a pattern that regulated your emotional state is no longer active, you are forced into something more fundamental. Self-regulation without external reinforcement. That is where emotional maturity is forged. Not in getting the response you want, but in no longer structuring your emotional world around whether it arrives. And in that space, something powerful becomes clear. You are no longer negotiating for presence. You are defining what presence means in your life. You are no longer asking, will they come back in the emotional sense? You are asking a far more important question internally. Do I even want to return to a dynamic that required me to disappear from myself in order to be included in it? That question changes everything, because once you see your own pattern clearly, you cannot unsee it. Once you recognize where you overextended, where you overaccommodated, where you mistook inconsistency for depth, the emotional gravity of the situation shifts entirely. And that is why silence, when it becomes identity rather than reaction, is so transformative. It does not just change the relationship, it changes the person who is willing to stay in. That relationship without boundaries, so whether they come back or not becomes almost irrelevant to the deeper truth unfolding here. Because what has already returned is you to a version of yourself that is no longer available for cycles that require self-neglect to sustain connection. And in the end, that is the real power shift. Not that they might lose access to you, but that you finally stop losing access to yourself. In the end, what this entire experience really reveals is not just how someone else behaves in distance, silence, or emotional withdrawal, but how you behave when the familiar patterns stop working on you. Because when you remove pursuit, when you remove over-explaining, when you remove the emotional effort that was once used to keep a one-sided rhythm alive, something becomes undeniable. The dynamic doesn't collapse because love disappeared. It collapses because imbalance is no longer being maintained. And that is the real awakening. At first, it may feel like silence is about them, about what they will think, feel, or realize in your absence. But if you stay with it long enough, you begin to understand something far more important. Silence is actually about what you refuse to repeat. It is about no longer participating in emotional systems where your presence is taken for granted and your absence is only noticed when it becomes inconvenient. Because the truth is, when someone is used to your emotional availability, they don't always value it, they rely on it. And reliance is not the same as recognition. One is expectation, the other is awareness. So when you step back, When you stop filling the gaps, when you stop responding to inconsistency with more consistency than they offer you, you are not losing them. You are seeing them clearly for the first time without your effort distorting the picture. And that clarity is powerful, even if it is uncomfortable. Because what you begin to realize is that emotional dynamics are not defined by who cares the most in words, but by who carries the weight of maintaining connection in actions. And when that weight is no longer yours alone, the entire structure is forced to reveal its true foundation. Sometimes that foundation holds, sometimes it doesn't. But either way, you are no longer trapped in the illusion that your overextension is what kept it alive. And this is where the real shift happens, not in whether they return, but in whether you do. Do you return to old patterns that required you to chase emotional certainty? Or do you stay in a space where your presence is no longer conditional on proving your worth through effort? Because the highest level of emotional strength is not in getting a reaction. It is in no longer needing one to feel grounded. So if silence changes anything, let it change this first. Your relationship with your own value, not as something you earn through pursuit, but as something you stop abandoning in the process of loving someone else. And when you reach that point, you understand the deepest truth of all you were never losing them by staying silent. You were finally choosing yourself by not breaking it.